The courtroom was silent, the kind of silence that feels heavy, like the air itself is holding its breath. Every eye was fixed on the woman standing at the center of it all. She was calm, too calm, her posture straight, her expression unreadable. The officers who had arrested her weeks ago sat just a few feet away, their smug confidence beginning to crack under the weight of her steady gaze. They had been so sure of themselves back then, so certain they had her right where they wanted her. But now, as the judge flipped through the final pages of her file, something shifted. A faint murmur rippled through the room, growing louder as the realization began to dawn on everyone present. This wasn't just any woman. This wasn't just another case. This was something none of them could have seen coming. It had started, like any other day in the small town of Willow Creek, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone and nothing much ever happens. That was until the night of the arrest. The police had been called to a quiet neighborhood after reports of a suspicious person lurking around. When they arrived, they found her, tall, poised, and undeniably out of place. She didn't resist, didn't argue, just let them cuff her and take her in. The officers were convinced they had caught a criminal, someone who didn't belong. They didn't bother to ask too many questions. Why would they? She fit the description, and in their minds that was enough. But as the days turned into weeks, strange things began to happen. Evidence went missing, witnesses changed their stories, and then there were the phone calls that came from numbers no one could trace, voices that spoke in codes no one could decipher. By the time the trial began, the officers were confident. They had built what they thought was a solid case, one that would put her away for good. But as the proceedings unfolded, cracks started to appear. Her lawyer, a sharp-eyed man with a reputation for winning impossible cases, seemed to know something no one else did. He asked questions that made the officers squirm, questions that hinted at a truth they weren't ready to face. And then, just as the prosecution was about to rest its case, he dropped the bombshell. A single piece of paper, handed to the judge, changed everything. The room erupted in chaos as the judge read it aloud. The woman they had arrested, the woman they had tried to frame, wasn't just innocent. She was something far more dangerous. She worked for the CIA. The officers froze, their faces pale, their confidence shattered. How could they have known? How could they have guessed that the woman they had so carelessly accused was part of an organization that operated in shadows, that answered to no one? The judge slammed his gavel, demanding order, but the damage was done. The truth was out, and it was clear that this was far from over. As the woman turned to face the courtroom, her eyes locked with the officers who had tried to destroy her. There was no anger in her gaze, no fear, just a quiet determination that sent a chill through the room. She didn't say a word, but the message was clear. This wasn't just about her. This was about something much bigger, something that went far beyond the walls of that courtroom. And then, just as the tension reached its peak, the doors burst open. A group of men in dark suits entered, their presence commanding immediate attention. They moved with purpose, their eyes scanning the room as if they were looking for something or someone. The woman didn't flinch, didn't even turn to look. She knew who they were. She knew why they were there. But the officers, they were clueless, their confusion written all over their faces. As the men approached the bench, the judge leaned in, his expression grave. Whatever they said to him, it was enough to make him call for an immediate recess. The courtroom erupted again, louder this time, as the woman was led away by the men in suits. The officers watched in stunned silence, their minds racing. What had they gotten themselves into? And more importantly, what was going to happen next? As the doors closed behind her, the woman allowed herself a small smile. This wasn't the end. Not even close. In fact, it was only the beginning. But for now, the officers would have to wait. They had played their hand, and they had lost. The real game was just getting started, and this time, they weren't the ones holding the cards. The question was, who was? And what did they want? The answers were out there, hidden in the shadows, waiting to be uncovered. But for now, all anyone could do was watch and wonder. Because one thing was certain, nothing in Willow Creek would ever be the same again. The men in suits moved quickly, their polished shoes clicking against the courtroom floor as they escorted the woman out. She walked with purpose, her head held high, as if she had expected this moment all along. The officers, still seated at the prosecution's table, exchanged uneasy glances. One of them, a seasoned detective named Greg Harris, clenched his fists under the table. He had been so sure of the case, so confident in the evidence. But now, doubt gnawed at him. Who was this woman? And what had they just stumbled into? Outside, the courthouse, a black SUV with tinted windows idled at the curb. The woman didn't hesitate as she was ushered inside, the door closing behind her with a soft thud. The men in suits followed, their expressions unreadable. As the vehicle pulled away, the woman finally allowed herself to relax, just a little. She leaned back against the leather seat, her mind racing. This wasn't how she had planned things, but then again, nothing about this mission had gone according to plan. Back in the courtroom, chaos continued to reign. Reporters scrambled to make sense of what had just happened, their cameras flashing as they shouted questions at anyone who would listen. The judge, visibly shaken, retreated to his chambers, leaving the officers to face the growing crowd alone. Greg Harris stood, his badge glinting under the fluorescent lights. He tried to maintain his composure, but the weight of the situation was starting to crush him. He had been a cop for over 20 years, and he had never seen anything like this. The woman's name, as far as anyone knew, was Elena Carter. At least that was the name on the arrest report, but now it was clear that wasn't her real name. The piece of paper her lawyer had handed to the judge had revealed her true identity: Agent Elena Reyes, CIA. The implications were staggering. Why had a CIA operative been in Willow Creek, a town so small it barely registered on a map? And why had she allowed herself to be arrested in the first place? The questions swirled in Greg's mind, but there were no answers. Not yet. As the crowd began to disperse, Greg pulled his partner, Officer Lisa Morales, aside. Lisa was younger, newer to the force, but she had a sharp mind and a knack for seeing things others missed. "This doesn't add up," Greg said, his voice low. "Why would a CIA agent let us arrest her? Why go through all this?" Lisa shook. Her head, her dark eyes narrowed in thought. "I don't know, but something tells me we're not going to like the answer." Meanwhile, the black SUV sped down a quiet highway, heading toward an undisclosed location. Inside, Agent Reyes finally broke the silence. "You took your time," she said, her tone calm but laced with irritation. One of the men, a tall figure with a stern face, glanced at her. "We had to wait for the right moment. You know how these things work." Elena nodded, but her mind was already elsewhere. She had been undercover for months, working to uncover a network of corruption that reached far beyond Willow Creek. The arrest had been a setback, but it had also given her a unique opportunity. Now, she just had to figure out how to use it. Back in town, Greg and Lisa began to dig deeper. They started with the arrest report, going over every detail with a fine-tooth comb. The call that had brought them to the neighborhood that night had come from an anonymous tip. The description of the suspect had been vague: a tall woman dressed in black, acting suspiciously. At the time, it had seemed straightforward, but now Greg couldn't shake the feeling that they had been set up. "Who called it in?" He asked, flipping through the pages. Lisa frowned. Anonymous. No name, no number. Just a voice on the line. As they dug further, they discovered something even more troubling. The evidence they had collected, the fingerprints, the photos, the witness statements, had all been processed by a single technician, a man named Carl Jenkins. Carl had been with the department for years, but something about his work on this case didn't sit right with Greg. "Let's pay him a visit," Greg said, grabbing his coat. Lisa followed, her unease growing with every step. Carl Jenkins lived in a small apartment on the edge of town. When Greg and Lisa arrived, they found the door slightly ajar. Greg's hand went to his holster as he pushed the door open, his heart pounding. Inside, the apartment was a mess. Papers scattered everywhere, furniture overturned. And in the middle of it all, Carl lay on the floor, unconscious but alive. Greg knelt beside him, checking for a pulse. "Call an ambulance," he said, his voice tight. Lisa nodded, pulling out her phone.